So, what is the real story behind the Beatles' first single? Let's find out. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here, talking about movies, music, and monsters. And today we're talking about music. This is just a short one, but the reason for this is because we're celebrating the fact that 60 years ago this month, the Beatles came to America and performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. 60 freaking years. Man, does that make me feel old. All right, now be honest. Who out there actually saw the show live in 1964? I can't wait to read about the memories and stories of you guys in the comments about this one. I would love to say I saw it live, but at the time I was only -4. But over 73 million people tuned in. And speaking of tune in, if you guys want a deep dive into the life of the Beatles, and I mean a really deep dive, check out Mark Lewison's book called Tune In, all about the Beatles, more detail than you could possibly stand. It's fab and gear and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so the Beatles' very first single. And no, this isn't the standard story about who played drums, Ringo or Andy White. It's not that. This is much more interesting. During interviews where Paul McCartney would be talking about their first single release, he would always say things like, "We just told them that we're doing our own original material and that's that." And I'm sure he did say that. But that's not really the way it went down. The incredible George Martin, Beatles producer, was planning on releasing their first single with a song by Mitch Murray on the A side called How Do You Do It? And the Beatles' Love Me Do on side B. But at the end of the September 4th session of Love Me Do, which is the session where they actually did the version with Ringo, John Lennon went up to George Martin and said, "Hey, we really should have original music on both sides." So that's really kind of why the Beatles all believed that they eventually got both sides of the single. But this is the real reason. Publishing. Money. Ardmore and Beechwood, which was EMI's publishing company, they thought that if the Beatles were kind of a one-hit wonder, this would be their only chance to make any publishing rights on the one Beatles song. There'd be no money coming in for like publishing and sheet music, so they convinced George Martin to put Love Me Do on side A, shifting How Do You Do It to side B. Believe it or not, George Martin at the time really didn't think that Love Me Do was all that good, and he was convinced that How Do You Do It would be a #1 hit. But he reluctantly agreed to swap them, putting Love Me Do on side A, and How Do You Do It on side B. But then Mitch Murray, the guy who wrote How Do You Do It, he also thought that his song was going to be a hit, and he refused to let them put it on side B. Quite the dilemma we got going on here, folks. And on top of that, Mitch Murray actually heard the song recorded by the Beatles, How Do You Do It, and he hated it. So at that point, and only at that point, did George Martin reluctantly agree to allow the first single go out with original Beatles songs on both sides. Love Me Do on side A, P.S. I Love You on side B. And historically, when you look back, actually everybody was right. The Beatles were right because that single made it right into the top 20. And Mitch Murray was also right because George Martin gave How Do You Do It to Jerry and the Pacemakers, went right to #1. So thus is the story of the very first Beatles 45, which was released on October 5th, 1962 in the UK. However, it reached #1 in Australia and New Zealand, and eventually the US on the US Billboard Top 100. So that, my friends, is the real reason the Beatles had all original material on their very first single. However, there was this very nasty rumor going around that Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, just might have bought up thousands of copies of that first single to push it up the charts, but that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I really hope you guys enjoyed that very brief retrospect on the Beatles' first single. In fact, if you're new to this channel and you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing. I've got new content coming all the time. In fact, the next video coming this weekend, the 1960 version of The Time Machine. As always, if you have any questions, drop them down in the comments and I will do my very best to try to answer them for you. And feel free to stop back anytime as we continue our conversation on movies, music, and monsters. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Danger, danger.